Well, hello everybody. Welcome to my still life live stream class here at East Oak Studio. Right now I won't go over all of my materials, but I'll just say what I'm going to be using at the moment. So with me right now I have some, I believe it's vine charcoal, which I may or may not use. I have a knitting needle, a knitting eraser. I'm gonna, if I go in and draw in some lines with paint, I'll be using raw umber with a bristle brush and just terp. So, oh, and another thing that I just made right before this is a little viewfinder that's exactly half the size of my canvas. Because the first thing I'm going to talk about is composition. So I have a blank canvas, which I put a wash of transparent oxide red and ultramarine blue with Gamsol. And now I have to sit and kind of think, where do I want to place the objects on my table, or on my canvas with this table. So one way I can either do it with my fingers. This is a little bit more safe. I know that I want a little bit of the orange table at the bottom because I think that color works well with the neutral grays and blues in the composition. So I want a little bit of that. So I'm just checking where I generally want to place things. I have my left eye closed. I'm looking through one eye with just one eye. Okay. So I've chosen with this composition to, the last one was a little bit more simple. The last live stream still life I did was a little more simple. This one, I wanted to incorporate some more gritty, raw, natural elements to it with some textures and really think more about an artistic composition rather than, before I was just thinking a little bit more just for educational purposes, whereas this I feel like has that and a beautiful rhythm to it. So let's see, if I want the table, a ruler, I just want a little strip of table. So I draw that straight across. So then, let's say if I wanted a little bit higher where that could be the lip of the table, then there's a little bit more of the orange. Go ahead and get in some of my straight lines. So then, when I was looking in my viewfinder, I was looking for key points. One was that I wanted some of the table, and two, there's in the setup, there's this piece of wood that's sticking straight up and down. And I know I just wanted to kind of, the top of the canvas have a little bit of space before it hits that. So now I have this kind of space that these objects exist in, from the top of the table to that. So I'm gonna say, now I'm gonna decide on my canvas where I want the edge of the wood to stop. So right now what I'm doing is I'm kind of figuring out key points to go off of that I'm going to start making my measurements off of. So I think I want that piece of wood to exist maybe about this far away from the edge of the canvas. That one's going to stop about there. And then maybe I want the pot to maybe have a little bit more space on this side. That might change a little bit. So then I'm going to start trying to take some measurements. So let's see. I'm gonna first try from the bottom of the top of the orange table to the top of that wood piece, and then see if there's anything else I can compare that to. So from there to there, I can kind of get from the edge of the wood to a point on the other plank of wood. So I think that's a good measurement to start out with. So start from going here to here, go from here to here, and I'm going to make a mark. So from bottom of the table, top of the piece of the wood is the same distance from the edge of this wood to a certain point on that other plank of wood, which once I go a little bit further, you'll understand what point, but it's kind of where it starts to break on the inner side. And also, I think we sent out 2 images. One was from the camera angle, and then the other one was I took with my phone that was a little bit more accurate to what I'm seeing. But both of them are a little bit off from what I'm actually seeing, and I'm slightly moving back and forth, so it's going to be a little bit of everything. So let's see. So if I want to do that, that to there. I want to find where the wood, where the bottom of the wood ends. So I'm going to go from the table to the bottom of the wood. I'm going to see where I can find with that. Put my charcoal. So the beginning is a little bit slow, but just taking the time to make some measurements. Okay, so I see if we cut this from here to here into thirds, I get some good measurements. So I'm going to separate that into thirds. And there's some times where I'd go about this a bit more off of impulse, but I like to show some measuring techniques because I think it's helpful, and I definitely do it all the time. So from the bottom of the table to the top of that piece of wood in thirds, at this third I get the bottom of the piece of wood, this third I get the top of the piece of wood, and then this third up here is the top of the plank that's sticking straight up. Then I can compare the height to width. And I can see the height of this to the width is that plus the plank. But I actually want to scoot it over a little bit. That can be the edge of the table. This can be the edge of the piece of wood. And then we have the top and the bottom. So take that measurement, flip it horizontal, put this, make a mark, trace this straight up, and you get the plank. This just going to do it rough. This kind of goes up. Got some wood in here. This has a tilt to it, so there's this kind of triangle shape in here. Then I want to stay true to my measurements, so if I said that was the top, I'm going to go higher. Okay. So now I'm going to take some of these measurements to find out where these things end up. So what I'll do is I'll close my left eye, look out of my right eye, and use my right arm so it's just one straight view when I'm measuring. So let's see. Just taking a measurement and comparing it to other things to see if I can find anything. So from the bottom of this piece of wood here to the top here brings me pretty much horizontal from this edge to right where the bottom of the pot starts to turn. So I'm just going to double check that and see if I want to use that measurement. Okay. So from here to here is, keep losing my charcoal. Just put a mark down. And then double check that that is what I was going for. There, from here to here. Yep. So that's where the edge of the ceramic pot starts to go. So if I have that marked, I can start to find out where about I think the bottom of it sits by comparing it with my needle horizontally to see how much space up on here does it cross. So if I hold this up and I have the top of my knitting needle at the bottom of the pot, and then I'm just holding it so I get a straight line across and seeing where it crosses through on this chunk of wood right here. And then that's where I'm going to try and figure out where exactly that lies in comparison to this. So there's just a little bit of space. So it's about here, and then I'm gonna double check it. Just hold it like this. And that's about how much space I thought was taking up in there. It could always be nudged around a little bit, but I'm just gonna keep moving. So if that's the bottom, and then this was the bottom edge, then I'm gonna take that mark and put it down here. Then I'm going to get rid of this one. And my method of drawing, not my method of drawing, but my technique of drawing on canvas changes. Last video I did, I was using the paintbrush and raw umber, but I've been recently doing some figure paintings where I've just wanted to get a little bit more precise with charcoal, so now I'm doing that, but it all works the same. This is just a little bit less messy. So then keep going. Just evaluating what I have and then deciding where's the next place I want to go. Double checking what I have. Now there's a piece of wood that the pot is sitting on top of. I can then now go to the bottom of that piece of wood with my knitting needle, scan my eye across the knitting needle and see where it is relative to this chunk of wood. If I had a bigger piece of charcoal, that would make it a little easier. So I see that the bottom of it starts on a vertical plane a little bit lower than this edge here, which again might not be absolutely right, but relative to my measurements should be pretty close. Plus this is at an angle, which makes this at an angle. So I always do my measurements a couple times. Hand is a little shaky. I could even, if this isn't long enough and you really want something that's gonna help out and not move, a ruler, I mean, helps a lot. So, if you can see that I have this ruler here, what I'm looking for is this little space right here. I'm seeing that from here to there. When I hold my knitting needle across is about how low this chunk of wood is. At least where it starts, which is right where I put this mark. So by doing that, I'm now starting to create depth with just line and drawing, as in this is now farther back and this is forward, this is even more forward. Whereas in maybe if someone was to just draw this out without taking measurements or really thinking about it with their eyes, if they put this and this on the same level field, then they would exist kind of in the same spot and not create that sense of depth. So that's something I'm really always looking for. So now what I can do is I can kind of start judging the tilts of these objects, or at least more importantly this plank, if it's straight or slightly tilted. So I'm using my table when I'm looking up there. I'm using my table as my straight horizontal. I know that on my canvas is straight horizontal, so I mean if I move it can be slightly off, but I'm gonna say in my mind it's straight and comparing everything off of that. So if this piece of wood is slightly tilted up compared to that, then that's what I'm gonna put, even if it's even more so, because this is not exactly straight when I look at it. I kind of have to be here for it to be exactly straight. But so I'm comparing off of what I already have down here and am calling accurate. So if that's straight, that's almost exactly straight as well. And then we have an interesting tilt up of this piece of wood, but that one's pretty straight. Just gonna look at it and see if it reads there. It's reading as a little bit tilted, but I think it's because it's raising off the ground and it's this shadow that's actually tilted, but it's relatively straight. Of course, if I wanted to make it more tilted and I thought that would make my painting better, then I would. I just see a slight tilt. So I'll take this straight and then I'll slightly tilt it. You know that if that's the bottom of the pot, there's a little bit of space underneath it. So I'm just kind of comparative measuring with my eyes how big that space is. I can even take, if I accidentally do some lines that I think are a little too dark, I can take a fan brush, kind of dust them away, and only keep the marks that I want. Okay. So now just keep moving. Some things I want to find out is how wide the pot is, how much further out this piece of wood sticks out. So let's see. I'm trying to remember where I got this measurement from. It's kind of from there to there. Let's see. So I'm just trying to find, basically when I go up here and I'm looking for a measurement, I'm trying to find measurements based off of what I already have correct. So I'll take a measurement from what I have correct, and then I'll be looking around the setup to find something of equal length. So that's where that is. Okay. So from here to here, if I give a little space here, it's kind of where the end of that piece of wood is. Now I'm going to double check that. I'm taking a measurement from here to here, then I'm flipping it and putting the edge of my knitting needle to the end of the plank of wood here. And it lines up about there. So go this, flip it here, and it's a little bit further out than what I marked. Wipe that off. So now if that's this part, that's that part, and then there's a tilt here. Okay, and that's the top. I mean, that's the band of that, but I haven't found the top edge of that plank of wood. So I'm going to see if it's equal distance from that. If from here to here is equal to here to the top of the top facing plank of the wood. And it's much smaller. Almost just half that size. So then I can take this, just draw a straight line. Just kind of playing this part out. Maybe this can get a little thinner as I go, but for right now it's okay. Okay. So we're going to say the edge of the pot is about where the edge of this is. Say the top of it. The top of it is about the same height as the height of this plank of wood here. Now let me see if that makes sense to that. And then there's the little part on top, which adds some height to it. I'm going to take the width of the pot with my knitting needle, and then I'm going to go around and try and find on any of this an equal measurement to it. So let me scoot back. So the width of it is just a little bit longer than the height of this. So it'll be here. So then I make a little mark, and then I'll double check it. This plus a little bit of height. That's pretty good. So then I'm going to shift this over. Then I'm going to try and find where this plank of wood, how it drifts up. So I'm kind of just looking, if this was my pot right here, you know, it kind of, if that's the top, it kind of hits around in here, comes out about up here. It's a nice slant. So I'm going to go with my ruler and put that in. And then I can look and I see that where the bottom of it is, I see it come right out from this part of this plank of wood. So that gives me the width of the wood, and then I'm gonna just try and match this line to this one. And yep, you have a little bit of a space in here. Maybe this higher. Maybe I want to make that a little bit lower. So the beginning drawing stages, you know, you imagine the artist to just be, you know, sketching it out all fluently and it just comes together. But really, this is the kind of stuff that is just, if they're not measuring what they're kind of measuring with their eyes and distances, they're saying, okay, how far away? They're kind of flicking their eyes back and forth between this space, and they're kind of comparing it to other spaces around them, and they're saying, oh, the length of this is quite a little bit longer than how tall this is. You know, maybe it's similar to how tall this is right here, but they're just kind of making these judgments with their eyes as they're sketching. So I think it's great to practice this, and then when you do have the opportunity Or maybe if you have to do something a little bit quicker and you just have to just go with it, you can kind of know what to look for. So just make sure all my lines carry through accurately. So before I go into drawing this out, oh yeah, I still need to figure out where the egg is. That, I'm just going to see where the edge of the egg compares to the edge of the plank right here. It looks like they almost line up. Just like a little bit to the right of it is where the edge is. Then I want to find where the bottom is. So basically what I do is I basically find a square that the object then has to exist inside. So you're kind of creating this grid for yourself. Whereas then I know that this pot has to exist within these measurements. I know that this plank has to exist within that and within this. You know, this and that, all of it has to exist within these two. I could take this measurement and compare it to different things. So let's try and do that with this egg. So I'm going to find, I found the outer left edge, then we'll find the bottom. The bottom of this piece of wood, it kind of lines up between this one and this one, or this bottom and that bottom. And then I can judge with my eyes that if it's definitely not perfectly placed in the middle of these two, I can see it's more to the left. So that's a way I could judge with my eyes, and I could probably say, okay, if there's about this much space, you know, I can look at how much it goes above this line. You could say, you know, somewhere around there, and then judge the bottom. But I'm just going to take some measurements. Can't get a good grip on this. So this edge. And then I can also see here that it's possible that I might have made this space a little too small. So what I'll do is I'll put in my egg and then kind of judge this distance and maybe shift this over, because I feel like that would be easier than shifting this over or making my egg smaller or something like that. So this. And now since I've switched over to using my left hand, I'm now closing my right eye. So it's a little bit wider than it is tall. So let's take the measurement of the plank of wood, compare it. It's definitely wider than that. So make it a little bit wider. Make sure it's shorter, so I'm going to bring that down a little bit and this up a little bit. Its reading is a little bit small, but we're going to go with it, and then if I have to adjust it, I will. So I think what I want to do is I think I want to nudge this over a little bit. So what I'm going to do is just take the marks that I have and just scoot them back. So I think this length feels a bit more lengthy. Maybe I'll put it down into here. Then the amount of space I push that back, I'm going to push this one back. So then I'm gonna erase these lines before and make that plank, the part where the plank's all messed up here, exist within there. Just getting some of the shape of it. That distance feels a little bit better. Draw some of the cast shadow under here, then reaches the egg. Okay, so there's a little bit of fabric that comes out of here that I like. Then has a cast shadow. Just gonna try to get some stuff in before I start figuring out where the paper goes. There's the start of a cast shadow here. This part is casting a shadow down here. It comes up. And then this is slanted, creating a triangular shaped shadow of cast shadow underneath here. Okay. So I'm just double checking my measurements here to find out where I want to put the paper. So let's see from here to here. Is that the size of this? Let's see, from there to there. That's past, where am I getting it in the middle? Okay, it's a little bit shorter, that's a little bit longer. Okay, so this is the little lip of my orange table. Then I think from here to there, I'm gonna just nudge this part up a little bit. Make this a little smaller. Maybe make this a little skinnier, which then will bring this in and even help push this length here. Nope. Let's erase what I had before. So one thing about composition is just when I set this up, I was just really thinking about these long moving lines. So it's like this long piece of wood here, long line going through here, this long line, and then the long line of the table. And then I'm gonna have some fabric kind of floating up here, and it's just gonna have all these kind of flowing lines. And that's just what I chose for this one. When I was trying to find objects to figure out the still life, I went outside and I found these broken pieces of wood, and I started moving them around, and I decided that that's what my composition is that's what's gonna drive my composition, is the long lines of the planks. So then I kind of just worked everything with that. Wanted the paper to kind of carry you into it, you know, this one kind of stark shoot up here to just bring one element that breaks it up, and then the rest kind of following along. Even this light colored pot that's going to kind of take you up and over, it's still going to, you're kind of just going to roll over it and still flow with that line, and it's kind of got a like lower left to upper right movement. And then I used the fabric to enforce that. So I wouldn't have went and put the fabric the opposite way, going from lower right to upper left, because I like this lower left to upper right movement. For some reason, it just happens to be that I feel like paintings that go from upper left to lower right kind of just make my eyes flow and want to look at the painting next to it. Just kind of flow out of the painting, whereas then if it goes from lower left to upper right, it just has a nicer feel to it. I think that's just a personal thing, but it's in my mind when I'm setting up a composition. So the fabric is here, and this has a certain shape here, and I could follow it exactly, but I'm kind of just thinking about my painting. You know, maybe I want it to flow a little bit longer than it does before it shoots up there. And now I'm gonna put in some of the paper. So now I've made this mark here as where the white table starts. So this is the bottom of the white table. So this little space here, I could possibly make even skinnier. And then there's going to be an even skinnier line above that. That's the little lip of the white marble. Oh yeah. And so we have a few minutes here until we go for a question break. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them, and I'll be answering all those questions, and I'll definitely be getting to color and stuff in a little bit and going over my palette and stuff like that. And I did this Instagram story where I had people ask me some questions about what they wanted me to bring up. So I wrote that down, and I've been trying to, and I'm going to try and hit all of those marks. So if you're anyone who mentions something on Instagram, I have it written down. So right now I'm just kind of going over the composition and drawing placement of multiple objects and stuff. Later I can get to the clean color and temperature shifts and all of that. So that's from that. Then there's going to be a little lip of the white table. And these lines can be slightly wrong, but I just kind of need to throw them up there and let my eye judge these spaces here. Yeah, so this is all going to be orange down here, or orangey red of the table. But then does that leave enough space here? Maybe that'd have to move down. So now I'm going to kind of judge where the paper should start. And I'm looking vertically to see where the edge of the paper, where it hits on my horizontal here. See that it hits there, and then I see that there's a bigger space here and a smaller space there by the edge of the table. So I'm looking at that. Now maybe I want to take a measurement there and see if I can compare it to anything else. Maybe from like here to here. There to there, that seems pretty right actually. So we can go with that. So there's just, when I'm going to measure something, I'm usually going to the outermost edges of things. So right now I'm going to the most bottom edge of my paper. So there's like this point of the paper, the very right, the one that's coming the most towards me. And I'm kind of coordinating its placement within this. So I'm thinking, okay, vertically what on here, or horizontally what on here does it match with when I go vertically? And it's about the middle of here, right in the middle between this piece of wood. Well, first let me double check that. So it's actually slightly to the right. So just a little bit over.
I think you guys have some questions?
Yep.
Yeah, so we have one question from Sarah Brown. Hi Alex, really beautiful tonal range in the setup. When setting up, what is your thought process in deciding on main focus areas and balancing other objects not to compete and keep a harmony through this piece?
No, was it Sarah?
Sarah Brown.
Sarah Brown. Thank you, Sarah Brown. That's an awesome question because it was really something I was kind of struggling with to figure out when setting up this composition, because I'm choosing not to have something completely in the middle, you know? So then it's kind of like, well, I'm looking at, okay, so a main focus is this pot, and another main focus, for some reason, or at least it's an anchor point in my mind, is this block of wood here, because they're two edge things. So I'm like, do I want to have equal space between this and the edge of my canvas as this? Well, no, because that won't feel as natural, so I think I want a little bit longer here. And then, so I'm just kind of, what I'll do is I'll put stuff up there and I'll come sit down, I'll look at it, I'll say, okay, that will look, let's see what it looks like nudged over a little bit. So I'll nudge it over a little bit, come back down, sit, look at it again. And I was also looking at paintings of, I believe the name is Emil or Emily, no, I think it's Emil Carlson, to get the idea of kind of for like the tonal range. And there's this painting that had a lot of these beautiful kind of blues and grays, and there was just this white bowl. So I was thinking about these ideas of all this gray and then kind of one bright object. And then it just so happened that, so in these grays I can see a lot of blues, plus there's a nice like muted pastel blue on the pot. So I see that there's like a little bit of rust on the bottom of the pot that has a bit of orange that kind of is the complement. And then this the actual table that's like orangey red is not what you're going to be looking at, but it's going to play so well with the what's it called? The complementary colors of all the muted blues and this kind of like neutral orange color that I'm going to get here. And there's a bunch of oranges throughout here. So yeah, it has something to do with, it is thought out, and then there's also putting stuff there and just letting yourself react to it. And then think, okay, is it too even? Does it need to be a little bit more spread out? Like, I think there was a time I had the egg kind of too much in the middle of this and this, so it didn't feel quite natural. So I had to move it over a little bit. You know, I had this bowl pushed over a little bit, and then it felt like it was too evenly placed on the edges, so just a bunch of moving stuff around. Yeah. Is there any other questions coming in? Great. So feel free to ask questions whenever one pops up, and we can get to them after the 45 minutes. We'll be taking a break to take questions every 45 minutes for 15 minutes. And if you ask the question and I didn't quite touch on the exact spot that you were hoping for, you can re-elaborate and ask a specific part of it again, and I'd be happy to go over it. So where was I? Oh yeah, I was going to find the placement of the paper. So then now I'm kind of judging tilts. So this kind of this tilts down a little bit, and then I'm always looking at negative shapes, so I'm seeing if this is a straight line of the table, that it then then I'm like imagining a triangle here, because I see that it's slightly shifted up compared to the flat table. So I want a little bit of a tilt there. Maybe that's a little bit too stark of a tilt. Bring it down slightly, but still have it a little bit more tilted up than the table itself. I can then erase the other line. I can see the very right of the paper in between the egg and this plank of wood. And here's a way of that. A lot of artists are kind of judging with their eyes without measuring. I see that this is the edge of my egg, and I see that this is the edge of my plank of wood. So then I'm saying, okay, I can see with my eyes that this is the middle. So I'm looking up there at the middle, and I'm seeing that the paper then crosses over slightly left of the middle. So then I'm saying, okay, there's the middle, this is going to be slightly left of it. And then that's how you get this kind of, the distances that you're looking for. So even when you're not measuring, you're still making measurements kind of with your eye and traveling across the canvas and making those judgment calls. So now I see that there's the very right tip of a piece of paper, and I can see that if I go to the tip of the paper and travel up, it goes a little bit in of this plank of wood. So I know it's on this plane here. And then if I'm looking for how high on the table it is, I'm going to then compare it to the bottom of that piece of wood. And there's a little bit of space before it, a little bit of space under this, travel over, and it looks like I got about right there. So then I could then either take the little mark I made here and just trace it across to there, or I could check the tilt and double check myself, which it looks accurate. But what I'm doing here is, you know, there's a piece of paper laying on a table, so it's creating this tilt, this perspective. So I'm literally holding my knitting needle up. My arm is bent, it doesn't have to be straight, and kind of tracing it with the edge of my knitting needle, the perspective line of that paper, and then just moving my body over to then transfer that line over here and see if it matches. So it's I pretty much got it straight on, right on, from here to the point that I made. And if it's slightly off, I can nudge it and stuff with paint. So it doesn't have to be too exact, but it can't be so off that the perspective looks weird, which will kind of jump out at you. So now here I have to make a judgment call, whereas I can see that in my subject, this line is a good bit higher up than this one. So that will tell me if this needs to go down, because I know this is accurate to that. So let me see how much space we have in between those two. So there's a good bit amount of space here. So I think I'm going to have to nudge this paper down a little bit. Yeah, let me make some measurements. I'm just taking the width of this paper and see if there's anything I can compare it to. The width of this is about the width of that. The width of this piece of wood is about the width from the bottom of this to the bottom of the paper, so I can see that I'm a good bit off. And now I'm going to double check that. No, it's not exactly. Let me try with this. No, it's a little bit smaller than that. So this with a little bit, if I take this and make it a little bit smaller than that width, judge it from here to here, I'm pretty close, but I think it's just going to need to move down just a little bit. And that can move up. So we're going to nudge that down. Nudge that up. I'm taking the tilt from this point to that point, and then seeing where it travels through on here. So I actually like the idea of it stopping about there. So this might go a little bit down, but I don't know. I might, for the sake of the composition, leave it that high so I have a good amount of this orange color. But if not, I'll move it down. But for right now, I'm not going to use that. I'm going to use this as my measurements, this stuff up here. So let's see the tilt of that. Another thing about composition is, and just setting up objects, is I like for it to make a little bit of sense that these objects would fit in with each other. So, you know, the eggshell with like the broken pieces of wood, and the pot, it has kind of like a farmhouse feel to it. And then when I think of this kind of farmhouse feel, and then also the aesthetic that I like, I'm going for these neutral colors. You know, I don't necessarily want some big bright color in there. Sometimes it's nice to have one little pop, but I think that the orange down here and playing up some of the rusty colors in here is going to be just enough to kind of balance them. Plus there's some nice rust on these nails sticking out here, that if I can get those in, it'll be kind of cool. There's some nails sticking out over here. And over here, but I don't really need to draw those in because they'll get covered while I paint. So I'm gonna keep going with the paper. So now there's a point of some paper over here that I'm going to see where it cuts in on this piece of wood here. Travel down, it's about here. It's just a little bit of space above that line. And that's the piece of paper that follows through to this one, although there is a little bit of a curve. This I'm just gonna sketch in, and I'll find the minute kind of details afterwards. Because there's actually two pieces of paper kind of doing two different things here. So So there's a piece of paper a little bit lower. It cuts in, which is actually connected to that. That's that one. Then there's another one a little bit in. This thing goes up, and that connects with that one. This stops. That can be erased. Then, let's see. There's a piece of paper that kind of goes from the bottom of the eggshell over like this, and I can see that there's kind of this triangle shape here. And it's a little bit of space from here to here. Let's see how far out it goes. So something like that. Just thinking what else I want to kind of get in before I move to sculpting out our two kind of main objects here. The way I work is usually if there's something important that I want to address, I tend to kind of work outward into that point so that everything around it is accurate, so that then when I'd hate to, you know, render this all out and this not be figured out and then realize that I'll have to move it to make everything else work. So that's why I'm kind of just going all over the place and leaving the egg in the pot kind of untouched at the moment. There's a piece that sticks out of this. More of a drastic tilt. This tilt sticks out a little bit further. It just goes up. Put in this boundary line. I like to see where lines follow through and touch other things. So this line kind of follows through and almost touches the edge of the egg. So when I make these discoveries over and over again, then everything kind of works relative to each other. And decisions are being made based on other things on the canvas and never on just one thing by itself zeroing in. Finding another tilt of paper. Usually I'll put in a tilt and then check it again. Then again, if there's anyone just joining in now, the way I check a tilt is I'll literally move my my knitting needle or pencil or paintbrush, whatever you're going to use, is always straight up and down, and I'm just twisting my arm like a clock. And then I'm matching the edge with the edge of whatever I'm trying to find the tilt of. And then I'm just moving my body over and transferring it. And usually I'll do it like this, kind of place there with my eye, I'll put it down, and then I'll go and double check it and then adjust what my eye judgment was. So that seems about right. Just checking some more tilt on the paper. That sort of goes there, right under and behind the egg. Checking the tilt of these things. Seems good. Okay. Just assessing what I want to go after next. There's definitely more to be done on the paper, but maybe I think there's enough there to start moving to these objects here to kind of get the drawing worked out. What if I have a piece of charcoal pencil? This will work fine. So right now I've found what I think are my boundaries of the egg. I'm gonna possibly adjust it if I feel like it doesn't look right. But I'm just gonna start rounding things out. First, so there's this opening in the egg. And what I'm doing with my eyes is I'm kind of judging where does that crack happen. So I'm looking at where the middle is and then traveling a little bit over to the left, and I see that a little bit over to the left of the middle is where the crack or opening starts to happen. And it's going to be fun to get into all these little shapes in here, but for right now it's just kind of this block in thought process. And if I was to go in with straight paint, I would basically be doing all of these things, but just while mixing the color, thinking about these things, it's just a little bit more, well, a good, decent amount more difficult than drawing it out first. But sometimes you like to challenge yourself and see if you can do it all at once. So I already had my measurement lines. Like I said before, this square that the egg is supposed to exist within. So I'm just kind of making these judgments based on what can fit inside of that square. This can go down a little lower. And there's a cast shadow that stops, and there's a little piece of light there. No, not perfect, but almost good enough to then make any minor adjustments of tilts and stuff with paint. Just judging that compared to everything. I can see that it's a bit more round up here. Just getting, the shapes are just getting a little too small for my charcoal stick. This line pushes up close to the edge. Okay, good enough. I can work here now. But so now before I put that in, I'm gonna just compare that this size here of it is correct compared to everything else. Let's see. Taking the width of my pot, and then I'm going to find something on my still life to compare it to. So I see that the width of this is a little bit bigger than how tall this chunk of wood is. And I believe that's the measure, that's how I got my measurement before as well. Let's see, take this. And it's a little bit bigger, maybe it's a little too big. Let me see again. Around here. So maybe it could come in a little bit. Maybe it could shift over, and that will make this space a little bigger. Yeah, let's shift this side over instead. Keep this one here. So that makes my middle point around here. Actually, a little over. Okay. So, if this is the top edges, I'm gonna see there's a point in this where it's the most out to the right and most out to the left. I wanna see if that's exactly in the middle of the bottom and top, or if it's slightly lower, slightly higher. So I'm gonna, my thumb at the bottom of the pot, and then the top of the knitting needle at where it bulges out. And I'm going to double that up and see if it's in the middle. It looks like it's pretty much in the exact middle, which makes it easy. So now if I wanted to, I could check if this, so if I trace this across here, around there, pretty good. So now let's find Again, now I have this box that this thing exists in. I can actually draw it if I wanted to. And now, I just want to make sure my two middle points on the top and the bottom are, in fact, the middle. Seems pretty good. Yeah, I think that's close enough. So if this is the most bottom part of my pot, then it can only go up from there. It can't get any lower. So straight from here, we're going to start, our tilt is going to start traveling up and upward to the right and upward to the left. I'm seeing its kind of simplified shape. Double check where my middle point is. That's good. This is a little bit lower. Now my drawing stage doesn't go too much more complicated than these simple lines, so we'll get into some paint pretty soon. I'm just looking at it and kind of stripping it away of the spout and the handle just to see what this kind of diamond shape that it is without those things. And just if you split this into fours, that each side kind of makes sense with the other. And by that, I basically mean that I'm sure it looks handmade, so I'm sure there's some imperfections, but that the tilt on this side, if it was flipped, is pretty much the exact tilt on that side, and vice versa up here. Whereas if this one is super tilted and this one's not as, it's just going to really point out. It's going to really stick out. And these are also things that I can push around with paint a little easier as well. This one's pretty rounded. Round this side off. This nice rounded top here. Sticks out a little bit. Lip here. Then this was kind of a guess of where the top little part of the lid is. So let's see. There's part of where the lid sits on that cuts down here. And again, when I'm looking there, I'm thinking about Where's the midway point? How much to the left or right is it from the midway point? So I know that there has to be an opening. So there's a little bit of space here for an opening. And then, so the space is smaller over here, and it cuts down, and there's a bigger opening down here. And then follow this middle point up so I can find the middle of this. Now I'm kind of going to the edge of the little top part, the outer edges, and then I'm tracing them down to see how much space between the edge here and there is. Kind of travel over, it's about this space, so I'll give it equal space on the other side. Let's just simplify with a little X shape. There's a thicker stem in the middle, but now to find the location of the spout, then again I'm going to go to the most outer edge of it, and I'm going to then put the edge of my knitting needle to the outer edge and travel down and see where it lines up compared to the edge of this, because I know I have that right on here. So this I will compare to it. And I see, let's see, that it is a little bit further out than the edge of that. If I was to just draw it in real quick, I probably would have made it equal, just because that's kind of what my eye was tricking me to think. So I know it's going to be somewhere. It's going to hit somewhere on this line. I'm just going to, I always double check. Yep, there's a little bit of space. That's good. So now I checked with that where it meets up. You know, if there was dots going across this horizontally where it hits, I compare it to something vertically, and now where it's going to line up vertically, I'm going to compare it to something horizontally. So I'm going to see where the tip is compared to the edge of the top of the teapot here, or we're just going to call it a pot. So the upper edge is maybe a little bit lower than that rim right there. Let's see, bottom edge. Bottom edge is about that much lower than the rim. Again, kind of creating this grid for my object to exist in. Then outer edge. I'm gonna imagine this kind of coming in. I can check the tilt. Then this tilt comes out a little bit more. So even when I make a measurement, I still want to come and look at it, just kind of sit back and look at it and say, you know, does that feel right? Because I could be off somewhere. The moment feels okay. Right there is just kind of, I see that there's this cast shadow from the little spout that then connects to cast shadow on the bigger base of the pot. That kind of connects here. Here. I don't need to get too crazy with that. But it's just almost, I was drawing with the cast shadow edge because it's almost a easier to see line than the actual edge of the spout because it just kind of is the same value as what's behind it. So I might be able to create a really nice lost edge there when I get to color. And there's just going to be so many nice different edge qualities to this painting because we have this kind of like grittiness of the wood kind of all sticking out over here, these really sharp nails, and the really sharp edges of the eggshell, and then the really kind of delicate feelingness of the paper, and this nice round ceramic feeling with this. So that's another thing when I'm thinking about composition. What's interesting is I want a variety of stuff. Not all the time, because you can have a painting of a bunch of different pieces of fabric that are all different colors, but they all have the same texture and you can still make it beautiful. But I personally like kind of when there's a lot of different stuff going on. And then I get to experiment with different brushwork, and every part of it will have different brushwork depending on what is being painted, and it's just a lot of fun to play with. Just sit back and compare. For some reason, a lot of times I don't feel the need to put the handle in, like if it'll look good without it. But I think for the sake, just painting what I see, I'll put it in. Plus, it might make it look better. I'm just with my thumb right now blocking out the handle to see what it looks like. So I think it might actually look better with it in, so I'm gonna go ahead and find the top of it. So again, I'm gonna go to the top of the handle and I'm gonna trace my eye across and see where on here it hits. And I'm gonna hold my arm, or my knitting needle, completely straight left to right. So it's just like a little bit higher than this. And let's see, compared to this, where the most top point of that is. It's pretty much right on that same edge here. So now I have a point there, which is good. Now I want to only go down from that point. I can then sort of see an abstract shape if I trace with my eye the outline of this, and then following up to that, I can kind of see the angle of this triangle shape that I'm creating there. Whereas it would exist here. Whereas in this, it's actually open-ended, but my eye, I kind of just imagine a triangle and what shape this triangle would have. Now I see if this is the edge of the pot, that the handle swoops over and connects a little bit lower. So I know that it connects somewhere around here. So these are all just anchor points for me. Now something to find out would be how far to the left it is. Hand's a little shaky. Try to stabilize it. So I see a little good amount of space here. Could be a bit off, but it's kind of what it's telling me. If I was to just make it up on my own, I would probably say that's even further out than that. Because I guess my mind wants to imagine it in full profile, where it's actually that part is a little bit farther back and the spout is a little bit farther in. So this is actually going to be a lot smaller of a space than you'd think. Kind of like when you're doing a portrait and the shorter side where the nose is blocking off some of the side of the face, we always tend to draw it a little bit bigger because we're imagining it fully straight on or fully profile. I'm just going to make sure. Make sure we get that, so it has to connect through here. This chops down a little bit more. I think that maybe this point is a little bit higher if I'm looking at this kind of abstract shape that it's giving me. This just has kind of a thin band around it and gets wider up here. This is a bit more rounded. Now the width of this. Just kind of nudging this stuff around till it gives me this feel. I can see that it's skinnier here and gets a little bit wider over here. Then again, it's another lost edge, but there is the inside here, but it's just really hard to see because it's a similar value to the background. So that would be in shadow. And handle's not perfect, but Maybe a few more adjustments and it'll be good enough. The only problem with charcoal like this is when I start to paint, I might lose some of my edges while I'm painting because if a little bit of Gamsol wipes it off. So there's limitations of all ways of doing it. Lost some lines where I rested my arm. Getting to a point where I'm gonna just kind of sit back for a second and just take a look and see if anything jumps out at me. Another thing that I'm doing here is this cast shadow here. Since there's like different variation in the pattern on the pot, it's a little bit hard to tell where a pattern stops and a shadow, you know, if it's a shadow that's stopping or if it's a pattern that's changing. And usually I can, if I squint at it, I can actually see the shadow shape. So it kind of wraps around here, swings up here. It's also significantly darker all under here, because the light's coming from above left and kind of hitting it here, and then the light's dispersing from there. Maybe a little bit lower, but anyway. Okay, I'm gonna sit back and look to see what other things I want to just decide to do real quick before adding some paint on there. So I'm kind of just flicking my eyes back and forth. There's a lot more I could do with the paper, but I have a feeling that I'll probably just block it all in generally all together and have to refine those lines, so that's okay. There's a few cast shadows I could put in. It goes up. This is coming down, casting a shadow here, and a shadow there. I'm finding how they all connect. So then all of this will be filled in. There's a thin line here of light and then shadow. This is casting a shadow over here. Nice long cast shadow that helps the composition. Questions, great. So there's 5 minutes till questions, so if anyone has any questions on my drawing stage before I go into color, or even on color before I really jump into it, feel free to ask. kind of sharpening up some things. That's casting shadow. That has the shadow casted. This piece of wood has the cast shadow. This follows through. And there's this nice triangle shape of a shadow here. I literally find triangle shapes everywhere. I guess they just help me draw. And I can see if they're skinny, acute angles, or bigger ones. And it's almost just another drawing method in my head. There's a cast shadow coming off the paper. Cast shadow here. I don't want to go too heavy with the charcoal because it will mix in with the shadows. But since this is a pretty neutral color palette, I think that it might be all right, maybe even help it. See this, just tracing the shadow, I see that it hits the egg around there, just starts to curve from here. I feel like there's even slightly cast shadow on the egg. So here was that fabric going up. And then there's a piece of paper. The fabric has a cast shadow. Just gives me more of an idea of how my painting's going to look. So now before I go into the drawing stage, I'm just going to look and see if I'm happy with the composition. See if it was what I was imagining in my head, which, you know, I want to definitely think about before I just start going. I'm trying to, things that I was thinking was, you know, I want just a little bit of space from the top of this to the top of my canvas. I want a smaller amount of space here from the edge of this wood to the end of the canvas, and I want a bigger space from the edge of here to there. I achieved that. I got a decent band of the orange table that I'll be able to put down there. So I pretty much got what I was looking for. There's some stuff that can slightly be moved around, but I think we're pretty good. And so yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask, but I can take questions before I go into painting.
That's great. We have 2 questions.
Mm-hmm.
Another great question from Sarah Brown. With the limitations of paint and the full spectrum of color our eyes can see, how do you abbreviate and make color judgments?
Okay. With the limited spectrum, is what it said? Of our paints, yeah. Well, I guess what we have to do is kind of judge based off of, we have to judge based off of the limitations of our paint. So if there was something here that was, let's say, very high chromatic red, higher chroma than my reddest red on my palette can go, well then I'm gonna have to put down my red, the reddest red that I can get in the highest value, whatever. And then everything else in my painting is going to have to be keyed down from that. So then whatever's next to that red is going to be compared to the red on my palette. I'm going to compare the red that's on my canvas to what's next to it in comparison to what I'm looking at to what's next to it, but not, I wouldn't be exactly copying what I saw in nature. So an example here is, a better example, we have pretty neutral color range in this setup. So I can give you an example in value range. So when I look at this, my brightest bright, when I squint down, is the edge of this eggshell right here. Now, the thing is, this is a flat canvas, you know, with light on it. It can be shifted. There can be more light on it. There can be less light on it. So there's no way to get that exact white. And it might even be brighter than the pure white on my palette. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to put down my pure white there. And then I'm just going to have to make judgment calls based upon that. So then, you know, I put the pure white there, and then I look at, so there's like this pure white here, but then there's, you know, it's casting a shadow, and then it's hitting this lip here and casting more white. But when I look at that, it's slightly darker than that white. So then I adjust by making it slightly darker, the amount darker that it is there. And then I'll go from that to my paper, which is now even darker than that, even though they're all technically white objects. So then I'm now calibrating, this is brightest, this is darker, but the paper is even darker than that. And then we go to the white table, and the white table is even darker than my paper. So in that way, we do the same thing with color. As in, I have a bunch of different grays and blue, and I can say, you know, if I block in this piece of fabric, I could say that maybe it's a colder, darker black color, and that the one here is a more of a warmer gray color. So the way I go about it is I kind of put down what I can most easily figure out first, and then compare the rest to it. So if I put down this black fabric, if I put that in, I'm then going to be comparing it to this. So whatever I put down there is going to change this. So if I make this black color a lot colder than what it actually is, then this is going to be probably colder than what it actually is. Now if I make it warmer than it actually is, then I'll have to adjust this even warmer than what it is. But the amount of coldness this is compared to the amount of warmness this is will be accurate compared to that. So it's a hard thing to kind of explain in words, but it's just comparing subtle shifts. So it's like I can look at this and I can say my most chromatic colors, my most chromatic blue is going to be where the light is hitting the most on this kind of baby blue color on this pot right here. So all my other blues, I'm going to try and probably not go as chromatic as that. Then I can say that this orange color down here is probably the most chromatic of the whole thing, so I can go down and put that in there and try and not reach higher chroma than that. If that's what you want. If I want to find some higher chroma notes in these shadows and stuff because I think it will aesthetically make the painting better, then I'll do that. But it's all comparing one thing off of the next and not necessarily, you know, going with a color checker and getting the exact perfect color and shifting it. So yeah.
So one last question from Lynn Bertrand. Wonderful description of drawing. Considering the perspective of the photo that we have, just wondering what your overall canvas size is that you are using. Thanks.
Oh yeah, so I have a ruler so I can find out, but I think it's 12 by 18 inches. Yeah, 12 by 18 inches, which is 46 centimeters by about 31 centimeters. So it's relatively small, but big enough to get the objects in a decent size.
And we have one more question from Richard Vega. Would you consider using a workable fixative on a charcoal drawn canvas to hold it down a bit?
So I do know people that do that, where they'll draw it in charcoal and then spray a fixative. I haven't tried it yet, only because I feel like the fixative would then would take away from the qualities of the lead ground. Whereas I really want the way that the paint goes on this lead ground, so I don't want to take away from that by putting another layer of fixative, or I know people maybe they put a clear gesso over or something like that, but I want the lead ground, so I don't. But maybe there's something out there that will say that it won't change it at all, and then maybe I probably would. But yeah. So I'll also go over that. I never went over what I'm actually working on. So this is an ACM panel, which is aluminum composite material. A lot of art supply stores are now selling them, but you can usually just get them from a local sign shop, which is where I got this, which I just bought a big sheet and you can cut it with a razor blade. And then I've been priming it with the Rublev lead alkyd ground, which you can put on and you're able to paint on it the next day. It dries really fast. Sometimes it dries a little too fast and it's hard to get the texture you want. But if you're priming a canvas, it's probably a lot easier. A panel, it's a little bit more difficult. So yeah, it's an ACM panel on a lead ground. Lead ground on an ACM panel. And what else? So I'm gonna start blocking in, or maybe laying in some shadows, but either way I'm gonna go over my color palette. So right now I have my color palette set up in the spectrum of, I have my neutrals here, then I have my blues, then I have my reds, then I have my yellow. So my red, yellow, blue. And in my neutrals I have, well, I'll go from left to right. So I have first burnt umber, which is my neutral red. I have raw umber, which is my neutral yellow. And then I have ivory black, that's my neutral blue. Then next I have ultramarine blue, which might be getting blocked by the canvas right here, but whenever I reach over right here, it's going to be my ultramarine blue, which I use a lot. Oh yeah. So I was blocking my neutral colors with paper towel, but burnt umber, raw umber, ivory black, ultramarine blue. Then I have my cobalt blue, which is a little bit higher value, higher chroma blue. Then we're about to go into my reds, so right in between I have a cobalt violet. Let me see, make sure. Yeah, cobalt violet by Winsor & Newton. Then I have alizarin crimson, but I've recently switched it to a more permanent alizarin, which is alizarin claret by Michael Harding. I have my transparent oxide red. And then just because it's a lower value, I put my transparent oxide yellow next to it. And then I go to my, it's not a CAD red, it's Naphthol red, which is, I find to be pretty much just as good as CAD red. I never really go that strong with red anyway, so it works perfectly fine for me. Then I have CAD orange, which is Winsor & Newton. Then I have Yellow Lake by Michael Harding, which is my high chroma, high value yellow. Then my lemon yellow hue, which I really like a lot. It's it's slightly colder, and just really nice to like neutralize and mix with purples, and it's also good with flesh tones. And then I have my Naples Yellow Light, which I almost use as just a really, almost like a warm white when I want to warm up something that's white, that's high value. Then Then I have my Permalba white. I always used to use titanium, and then I've been using Permalba ever since I took a workshop with Jeff Hine. And I believe we recently discovered that Jeff Larson also uses Permalba white. But sometimes I'll use lead, and then I also have a replacement flake white that dries really fast that I'll use if I'm just trying to get something down and I want it to be dry by the next day. That's by Gamblin, I believe. Yeah, here it is. Flake white replacement, and that's, so if I was to paint this painting and I wanted to be able to paint on it the next day, and I wanted all the paper and eggshell and stuff to be dry so that I could go into a second layer, I'd probably use this so that I'd be dry by the next day. Then I go on top of it with my Permalba white. Then I have this light blue mixture, which I make myself from the white, ultramarine blue, and a little bit of alizarin. It's just this nice high value blue with a little touch of purple. Depending on what I'll be painting, I'll either make it more purple or less purple, adding more red or less red. And then I have raw sienna, which I recently added to my palette, mostly for skin tones, and then my Viridian green. So let's see. And also I'll be using my medium is just half linseed oil, half Gamsol. And then in this cup, and then this cup over here, I have some Gamsol just to clean my brush off. So I'm just gonna look and think where I want to start. Maybe I'll just block in some shadow shapes to solidify the drawing and just to kind of get things moving. So let me find a brush I'd like to use. This could work. So I'm just gonna get some raw umber first. Maybe I'll neutralize it. Maybe I'll get some transparent oxide red and ultramarine blue. Thin it out and fill in some of these shadows. I made a little mark, so it was a little, thought it was a little too warm, so I just added some more blue. Now this is going to get a lot darker, but just for an underpainting, it's nice and warm. So I'm just going into my transparent oxide red and ultramarine blue. Go into this shadow, which is pretty dark. First trace the outline. So here I drew that line, but I'm probably going to lose it just by blocking this in. Maybe add a little bit of blue. Lock it in there. There's some nice, really dark notes. First I'll hit in there. And I usually build up my shadows with a few layers, so I like the first layer to be slightly lighter and a bit more warmth and chroma to it. And it's just a great way to solidify your drawing. So right now I'm using a, what is it? Well, it's the Michael Klein Rosemary brush, his series. But I believe that it's a synthetic sable brush, synthetic pointed sable. See, my lines kind of get ghosted away when I start to paint. So I have to be careful. I don't completely lose them before I get to put them in. That's a nice dark, rich shadow in there. Then we get the shadow going on under here. This is also going to start helping me set a sort of tonal range for my whole painting. Filling out the shadow edge of that. Go to where this egg is casting a shadow. Make sure I don't lose the drawing on the edge of the egg. Little pieces in there. Little line under the pot. The wood starts to separate over here, casting a shadow. So looking, I think possibly the first thing that I will do is put kind of a wash of orangey color down here where my table is going to be. And right now for this I'm using medium, but that's only because it's going to be a week until I paint on it again. Whereas these first kind of underpainting moments, if I was going to be working on it tomorrow, maybe I'll just use Gamsol so that it would dry by the next day. Because transparent oxide red and ultramarine blue together tend to dry a little bit slow. I think it's ultramarine blue that makes it dry pretty slow. But it should definitely be fine within a week. So I'm just adding a little bit more of the transparent oxide red and thinning it out so it gets a little bit more red, a little higher in value. Here's where I might lose the drawing of that line, which is okay. I can always just draw it again. Just to get an even block in. So we'll go here. I want to use a bigger brush. No, this is okay. Add a little bit of blue to it. That's probably good. Make sure I don't go too far off of this drawing where the table ends. I like this because it's just a nice long strip of orange that you're not going to necessarily look at. You're going to look at this stuff, but it's just going to help balance the color harmony so well. Let's see, I started to lose the drawing there a little bit. Gotta be careful. I also want my brush strokes to be a little bit random. Okay, so I could go further in. Maybe I'll block in a shadow shape. On this piece of wood here. A little bit higher in value than that one, but still a nice warmth to it. See where else. This whole edge of the wood here is a little bit darker than the other half. So this is doing two things. It's setting up a nice color foundation to paint on top of, and then also just helping me separate lights from darks for drawing's sake. Start to create some depth even before we really get into it. Sort of gets a little darker over here. Lighten up this edge a little bit. Feather this out. Okay. So now what I want to do is I want to look at, well, first I want to just block in one more shadow, and then I'm going to look at the whole setup and ask myself what I can most easily identify first, color and value. That can be sort of a cornerstone for the rest of my painting to compare off of. So I want to put in that shadow a little bit. Shadow here. This has a cast shadow to it. This is where the painting starts to have a little bit more life to it. You can start to see where it's going. The shadows in the paper are going to be pretty high in value, so I might not even block them in now, just wait. Outline some things. Okay. So, first thing I definitely think I can get is the white on that shell. I'm going to go ahead and put a pure white dot on there, but I'm going to make sure I get a clean brush to do it. It's pure white. Now I might even next Monday go in and add another layer of pure white, and I think that will even brighten it up a bit more. I can go ahead and put some on this side, just because it's not really even giving me the pure white, because it's kind of mixing in with a little bit of the underpainting. I can go ahead and maybe put a little bit of white. There's a highlight here. A highlight there. And it might not be that bright, but it can dry and I can scumble and glaze on top of it. Plus maybe it adds a little bit of texture on it. So now this is already starting to form a three-dimensional look. Okay, so what's going to be my next thing? Can go ahead. I think I could probably mix this grayish color pretty close, so let's try. So first I'll start off with ultramarine blue, transparent oxide red, and then I'm gonna, let's see, before I even go, I'm comparing these two and I'm thinking if I want this to be the bluer one and this to be the warmer one, what am I gonna do? So maybe it will just have a bit more of transparent oxide red in it. Then add a little bit of white. Let's see what happens. So that's looking a little too brown. So what I can do is I add more blue. I'm going to go ahead and add some black to it. So I find a color I think is close. See that seems pretty dark. When you can compare it to the white, it might be close. I could possibly, well, if I scrub it on, it's going to go on a bit lighter anyway, so. What I can do is, what might be even easier to find, is the darkness of this shadow. If I get in really dark like it is there, it might be easier to judge this blue color. So I used that brush for white, so I don't want to use that. Maybe I'll just trying to find a soft enough brush that will do the job. Clean off this one. Dipping into my Gamsol, cleaning off the brush, going back into my darks, which is transparent oxide red and ultramarine blue. I'm going to go ahead and put a pretty dark note here. Now, I don't want my shadows to get too thick, so I'm going to take my fan brush and kind of knock it down a little. Also, lighten the value just a little bit. And it's a lot warmer than what I'm seeing, but I like the warmth in the shadows, plus there might be a second layer of a colder shadow that will then have just little bits of this warm shadow coming through. So then I'm gonna mix up the shadow in there. Which first, yeah. So I'm gonna go with my transparent oxide red, ultramarine blue, and creep into the background color I started to mix, so it lightens it in value just a little bit. Put this in here, pretty dark. Now it's reading to my eyes as a little too dark, but I have a feeling that it's just because it's surrounded by all this light, and that I'll possibly be making it even darker as we move forward. Just keep remixing transparent oxide red, ultramarine blue. See, it gets really dark in there. Fades out a little bit. So now that I have a shadow, this color already seems a lot brighter. And I will layer up my shadow so it won't be all that warmth showing through, but the warmth coming through is gonna look quite nice with all the neutral blues and stuff. I'm gonna take another brush, getting into some ivory black and some transparent oxide red, plus white. So my thought process is that it seems like a gray, but it seems like a warm gray. So I'm going with black and transparent oxide red, because the black and white would make kind of a cold gray, so then the transparent oxide red would warm it up. A little more white. And this is just going to be kind of like, what's the word? Kind of like scumbled in or scrubbed in, because this I'll be putting on in layers as well. Because the first layer is just going to be kind of an underpainting, scrubbed in. So my canvas is telling me that this is pretty dark, but my palette is telling me that it's a decent bit high in value. So I think that somewhere in between is what is actually going to translate. Once I get this a good bit darker, everything here is going to get darker except for the eggshell. So we might be safe. So this is the thing that I like to remember, is that when I find this simple mixture for a background, I like to lock it in and know how to mix it every time. So now it's just black, transparent oxide red, and white. And I know that using just those three colors, I can adjust to get back to where I need to be to find this color. So I get white, transparent oxide red, black. And what's also great about that is that if there's some places where I feel like it should be, the color shifts a bit warm, I can add some transparent oxide red. If I see a place where it shifts a bit cold, I can add more black. Let's see. That part I made it a bit brighter, so I'll go closer to the light, because it's going to be getting slightly darker as it goes back, but I think it go a little darker than that. And kind of feather into the shadow. Be careful not to lose my drawing. Inevitably, some of it, little pieces of paint are going to get into, but try and do as least damage as possible. But if I accidentally do lose anything, I just think if I drew it once, I can draw it again in paint. So, to an eye that's just coming and looking at this without any kind of thought process at its stage now would think it's a very dark color overall in a very light colored canvas, and it might seem too dark, but I'm comparing off of what I think is right. So I know that that bright I want to appear really bright, and I know that I'm going to get darker here, which is going to make this brighter, and I know that the value in that shadow is going to be relatively at that value. So I have to trust myself that this is not too dark and that it'll work. And if you actually were able to take a color sample and move it straight over and ask, you know, and it was too dark, well, you could then just compare everything else based off of this darkness, and maybe everything else would go a couple steps down in value, but it would all still make sense, and your painting would just be a little bit darker, and if anything, maybe it would help your lighter lights. You could maybe really punch those in and make them feel luminous. Maybe get a little bit sketchy towards the end. Just trying to make the mark making a little bit more random so it doesn't look mechanical. I like the warmth showing through and the fact that I can go darker with a cool color on top. Blocking this part here. Running low on paint, so I'm going to mix more and not try and just scrape up any last remaining paint I can get. So I've got my ivory black, my transparent oxide red, and white. Now we're getting a little bit closer to the light source here, so it might be a little bit higher in value. I haven't decided if I want to actually capture the fold in the fabric that it's creating right there. So I'll just block it in with a solid color and figure that out later. Now paint has this weird way of, if I was to put this color down solid without scrubbing it on, it's kind of a colder color, it's kind of a gray, and you know, it's very solid. But I guess since I mixed it with a warm color, if you scrub it on, the warmth of the color, of the transparent oxide red that you added into it shows through within like the cracks of the paint or the hatching of the paint. So that's why I tend to build up these layers of kind of scrubbed paint or scumbling, softening some of these edges. Which I can do with this. And maybe this is a case where I like the idea of everything in the fabric being even softer than it actually is. Or not softer than it actually is, but really pulling out the soft qualities of the fabric so that the harder, grittier elements here appear more, bit more the textures that they really are. So I can soften this, bring this in. With the first layer, I always want to underdo it, then overdo it, so I'm going to bring some of this paint into this shadow. Now, if I'm thinking about drawing, there's a good amount of space between this cast shadow and this one, so I'm going to make sure that exists. So I think that the next easiest thing I can figure out based on this is this fabric here. Because when I look straight onto it, I can see all of its light. I can see all the light qualities of it. But when I kind of look back and squint at the overall painting, I can see how much darker it actually is from this, and how much lighter it actually is from, let's say, like, don't usually use pure black, but I can get close by the transparent oxide red and ultramarine blue, whereas then there's a shadow in here, which I'm not even too crazy about putting in yet, but I could put it in really dark to then compare the value of this too. So if I put in one really dark note, it might help me. Maybe even add a little black into it. So someone noted on my questions thing on Instagram about clean color, which I think is definitely an important thing, at least for the paintings I like to make. So I think it's just a lot about not contaminating colors with other ones. Like I'm using a different brush for these rich dark colors. I'm not letting any other colors get into that. I'm making sure that my medium and my Gamsol are clean enough to dip into. I don't dip too far in because I'll get some older paint. And if I was to do that, then it would just kind of look, you know, chalky or muddy. So I'm trying to be careful not to do those things. And then you would think that maybe black and transparent oxide red could create not a clean color, but as you can see, I think it also has something to do with the way that you apply it. So I think if you use a lot of paint and apply it, you apply it thickly, but kind of, you know, I scrub it in. But since I'm scrubbing it in with a lot of paint on my brush, I can get this texture, but also keep the quality. Whereas if I was try and do this with not enough paint on my brush, it would maybe be just like scraping the pigment and pulling it apart and making it look less clean. At least that's my thought process on it. I'm not exactly sure if that's scientifically why it's happening, but so I'm gonna go into this color. So I already have this background color on my palette. So I'm gonna mix this next one right next to it so I can compare it just like they are right next to each other in my setup. So let's see, so I'll start with black. My initial reaction to it was that it was a little bit colder than this one. So maybe it'll have more of a proportion of black in it than the other one, than the other background mixture. Because black is my neutral blue. But that's a little too cold, so I'm going to add some of my transparent oxide red into it. My mixture is maybe looking a little too purple. So I'm going to add my neutral yellow, which is raw umber. And I'm going to go with raw umber and black. Now seeing those two next to each other, I think I'm starting to get closer. Maybe a little bit higher in value. It's a lot easier to go darker in value the next layer. So if I make it a little bit brighter, that's okay. So let's see. Here we can see right what it looks like next to that color. It's a good bit darker and it's a good bit colder. I think it could go even darker than that. Maybe. Let's see. Getting a lot of warmth showing through, which I quite like, but I'll go over it with thicker paint and leave some of the parts showing through that might be a little too light. Don't want to completely lose my drawing of the stick here. See, I think I'm trying to use the not enough paint I have on my palette when I need to just go ahead and mix more. So then I think back to what mixture got me there. which I think in the end I decided that it was raw umber and black and white. And maybe if it goes a bit too greenish, then I'll add a little bit of transparent oxide red. More black. Maybe that is looking a little too green. Maybe I'll add a little bit of transparent oxide red and black. Starting to look better. Maybe bring it up in value a little. It's really hard. The darker the color gets, the harder it is to really get it on there when your ground is so light. But which also sometimes works in your advantage because you get to build it up and you get to keep these really nice warms showing through. So, for the sake of this, it's all right. Now I'm kind of taking the edge of my brush and then pushing down and scraping up to create a bit of a hard edge against this shadow. Scooting back to take a look. I definitely think that it went a little bit too green, but it might be okay because there'll be a second layer put on there. Just thinking if I want to fix that now in a few places. Let's put in more of that shadow color so that it follows through, makes sense. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and see if I can mix up more accurate color. So my thought process is if it looks, first I ask myself, like first instinct is I think it looks too green compared to that. But then I also have to think about, well, what color does that look like compared to this one? So to me, it looks more of like a darker blue. So then I think maybe, okay, so that looks too green and that is tending to look more of a blue hue. So then maybe the answer is more of a purple. Because the opposite of green is red and the opposite of opposite of the yellow is purple. So I'm getting a little bit of this yellowy green color. Okay. That's blue. It looks a little too blue, but now I touched very lightly into my cobalt violet. I don't think I need it, but I think that's getting me a little bit closer there. I have a little bit of glare, so I'm just looking over. Let's see. Dipping into my black, transparent oxide red, a little bit of white. You can see as I put it next to that it's darker and it's a bit more of a purple hue than this greenish hue. It has kind of these hints of warmth to it, a red type of warmth to it rather than this kind of yellow type warmth to it. And that's just in comparison, whereas maybe if you just looked at it, just that color alone, what I'm saying wouldn't make sense, but it's just the slight minute differences in comparison to something else. And that's why it's all relative to what's down on the canvas. Whereas if this was the first color I put down, and if I put it too much of one color, then this color would, maybe I wouldn't be saying that it's too green, maybe I would saying that it's not enough green. It's all relative to what's around it. Now I tend to spend a decent amount of time on my background because I think it's really important to the atmosphere of the painting.
Alex, we're just going to ask a question because we've got one question.
All right, one question.
So 15 minutes or so, but we're asking now.
Is it 15 minutes left of the whole thing, or just
15 minutes.
Okay, great.
Admired the quality, this is from Richard Vega, admired the quality of the aged wood in Lost Nest and was glad to see it in this composition. Are you going to use the same techniques here? Also, this is a pleasure to watch. The camera exposures are spot on.
Awesome, thank you, Richard Vega. I absolutely was, I thought that what I got in Lost Nest was a really cool quality. I'd never really painted wood like that before, but I think I really liked the way I achieved it, so I thought with this still life I'd really like to get those same qualities. So I'm going to try and paint them with the same kind of techniques, and I'm going to be using some palette knife and some scraping and stuff like that. So, and all of these beautiful camera angles are all thanks to my good friend over here, Joe Hawkins, who set all this up. Did awesome. So I'm just always, it's never too late to completely change anything if you need to, so I'm just kind of going back, looking back and forth, making sure I'm not going too dark or anything, because I'm thinking about this is really going to go and its value in comparison to this. I definitely think the next layer of background color I can go colder, but it's going to be nice that it has this warm undertone to it. You can really kind of zero in and get lost, and this feels like such a cold color to me, but when I look at it as a whole, it's actually a bit warm, so I think I'm going to go ahead and maybe add a little bit of colder color on top of it, but then the next layer really try and play that, and then the hatching of warm and cool is gonna really look nice. Finish filling in this background fabric piece. Gonna go ahead and probably leave it somewhat like this so that I can paint darker and colder on it later. So then I'm gonna wipe my brush off and go into, I'm using very similar colors when I go back into this background color as that, so I'm not too worried about cleaning my brush off too much or getting a new one. Just going to clean off the same brush, and then it was my ultramarine blue, transparent oxide red, to my black a little. Now let's see, that looks a little too cold. Add a little bit of transparent oxide red. Now this feels a bit too blue, but I feel like if I put it in and scrub it in with the other paint, it might just go to this in between warm and cold that I'm looking for. I think, look. My brushes hate me because I just destroy them by scrubbing in like this. I'm just kind of going over it because I don't want it to be too thick in some areas. Some place where I feel like the underpainting isn't showing through enough, just wiping it back up. And this is really just all about, this part of it is just about aesthetics, my personal preference. Now I see in between the shadow into the shadow is a cold or darker color. I just want to put a little bit of it before I move on. Just feathering a little bit with my fan brush. Scrape up some of the paint right after the shadow. Now this is not really based off of what I'm looking at. It's sort of just, I look at other paintings, and when I see certain things painted in a certain way, I try and sort of dissect it. And in a lot of paintings that I like, there's this really nice kind of warmth of the underpainting showing through in some parts. So I make sure from the beginning that I capture that, because it's a lot harder to get back once you lose it. So next, we only have a short amount of time left. So my decision making where to go next. Let's see. Missed a little bit of background color here. Just starting back and forth. I could scrub in a little bit of color for this wood texture. Just something to go on top of, because I know that this is going to be, when I squint at overall everything, at the overall image, this is a very good bit darker than this. And this is somewhere in between, but closer to this value. So let's see. Maybe I'll start off with raw umber, burnt umber, and some black just to neutralize it out. Add white. So now I'm looking at this color in comparison to these two. I think it could probably go even brighter. Using a lot of white. Raw umber. Let's just see what color that is. It's too white. Let's go in between these two. Add a bit more warmth. Maybe add a little bit of transparent oxide red. Just thinking about an underlayer. Let's add in a little ultramarine blue, transparent oxide red into it. Then work into that lighter color. Now that's a little too dark, but maybe if I wipe it. It's interesting color. I just go and I try things. I say, oh, it's a little too light. Oh, it's too cold. This maybe looks a little too cold. But this is going to get so many different kinds of layers on it to create a wood texture. I just went into my raw umber a little bit. Five minutes, all right. So we only have 5 minutes left. So I'm just putting in some things to help me with my next layer tomorrow, or next Monday. So it's kind of this warm neutral color for an underpainting for it. You know, some places it's going to get a lot colder, some places a lot warmer, darker. But it's going to be fun to play around with those things. Going into some raw umber because it was a little burnt umber because it was a little too cold. Bring up some of that underpainting. Just comparing some of these colors to this color here. I think when I go into it next week, it's going to be really important to kind of establish this color down here because it's a bit too chromatic at the moment and throwing me off, but I think it's going to be a really nice underpainting color. So I'm just going to have to stay and dry. Just go ahead and put a little bit more color on the wood. It's interesting because it's all relative. So what I'm seeing here is a warmer color compared to this, where I'm seeing a lot of blues in here, but your mind wants to think that wood is brown. So then you're thinking, okay, I have to grab my brown colors and it has to be brown. So when you put down something that's too blue, it just looks strange, but you have to just really compare it off of everything else. And if you make the right comparisons and it's telling you you do have to make it that much bluer, then in the end it's going to look right. My only mistake here would be to make it too dark early on. I see some purple in that. Just getting some more of my neutral brown colors just to kind of finish blocking that in. Now when I look at this, it's a lot brighter and warmer, so I'm going to get into my Naples yellow light and just block that in. Maybe even warmer, a little transparent oxide yellow. A few spots. There's a few lighter spots here. This lighter bit coming through there. All right, so that's as far as we're gonna get for today. I think we got a pretty good start. I didn't get to block it all in, but I think tomorrow next Monday I can quickly finish the blocking and then get into some fully colored rendering. So thank you all for joining us, and I can't wait for next week. Thanks.